Today was the court-imposed deadline for the Trump administration to reunite families who were separated due to that DOJ zero-tolerance approach to illegal immigration. Of course, all the usual suspects in the media painted a grim picture.
They are indicative of this emotional pain and struggle that these families have been dealing with over the last several weeks.
I met two children from two different families, one a 7-year-old boy who loves the superhero Flash, and the other an 11-year-old girl who has to help her father operate a smartphone and likes to play basketball. They are normal kids in almost every way. Normal kids dealing with a very difficult situation.
Tonight, the administration announced that 1,412 children have been delivered to parents in immigration custody, which took hundreds of staffers, apparently, to carry out. Lord knows how much money it took. But the fact that this ever happened drove the left to cry, Trump's a heartless guy.
A practice that's been called heartless and cruel by Republicans who almost never speak out.
They're being held, and they're being held against their will. This is a Trump policy that is blatantly cruel.
Most of Donald Trump's base wouldn't tolerate seeing white children treated like that.
Reverend Al, histrionics aside, the White House's hands were tied, remember, by that 2015 ruling by Obama Judge Dolly G, ordering that even children who crossed the border with parents had to be released from custody in 20 days. Well, that meant either Trump continued that old policy of catch and release, family units caught entering our country illegally, or parents were detained separately from their minor children because the children had to be released. The administration chose the latter path, which led to, well, mostly Democrat-led protests across America, which ultimately then drove the White House back down. It was a total mess. Congress had the chance to change the law, to close the loopholes, and let's face it, they could have tightened the asylum process and expedited the deportation hearings. But they chose to do nada. How brave.
We have a broken immigration system. Doesn't work for anybody, least of which is to control our border. And so when we get to the moment where we're actually solving this problem, which I would prefer sooner rather than later, I really think it's going to gravitate around these 4 pillars.
But then came a typical sneak move that we expect from Democrats, but not from the president's own party. Before running to the airport today for their working August recess, the House held a sneaky voice vote on a Homeland Security appropriations bill that will only end up adding to our problems at the border. The amendment basically codifies DACA and was the brainchild of Congressman David Price, a Democrat from North Carolina. But it wasn't just David Price. GOP Congressman Kevin Yoder, who's the all-important chair of the Homeland Security Subcommittee, was also in full support of the idea, especially this part that made it easier for illegal immigrants to claim asylum if they credibly fear gang-related or domestic violence. Yoder claims he was moved to change his position on asylum due to the influence of his mother. He said today, quote, "As a son of a social worker, I have great compassion for those victims of domestic violence anywhere, especially as it concerns those nations that turn a blind eye to crimes of domestic violence." Well, forgive me, Congressman, and I appreciate your personal story, but your family history shouldn't be allowed to thwart the president's immigration agenda and, frankly, imperil the party's prospects in the midterms. Until 2016, asylum was traditionally reserved for those in fear of persecution for things like their religious, their political, or their ethnic backgrounds, not due to one's fear of crime or the threat of domestic abuse in his or her home, as horrible as that is. So if the new barometer for asylum status is whether a foreigner feels safe in his or her home country, well, might as well just throw the borders wide open. It doesn't matter if you have a wall or no wall, because hundreds of millions of asylum requests are going to come pouring in. Now, it's worth remembering the Center for Immigration Studies estimates that if this House language, like that in the Gang of Eight bill, were to prevail in the Senate, we could be looking at 32 million new voting age adults living in the United States by the year 2036. Democrats want desperately to replace America's more conservative electorate with foreign, younger, usually more socially liberal voters. What does that mean? I can tell you one thing it means: no more Donald Trumps. And big business will revel, of course, in the glut of low-skilled workers in the midst of what they claim is a labor crunch. They also won't have to raise wages much, right? Which is what they're starting to do now. They're having to do it to fill these jobs. And that means more profits for themselves. But beyond all the tears, the meltdowns, and a lot of sad stories, some sob stories, it's critical for Republicans not to cave to the Democrats on immigration. This is just a desperate play by the resistance because Trump is beating them on the economy.
The future's pointing north big time, up 233 points right now. The market's loving this.
I think we're on our way back up, maybe to those January highs.
Wow, we may have 5% GDP growth coming Friday.
Because their phony Russia collusion pipe dream is crumbling.
There's just not a lot in the Trump collusion bucket to look at.
And because they are incapable of separating the president from his base.
According to our new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, 88% of Republicans approve of the job President Trump is doing. The only president with a higher approval rating within their own party at this point in their presidency was President George W. Bush, less than a year after 9/11.
Now is not the time for Republicans to give in on immigration enforcement or melt because of the cheap, emotional media games. By the way, games that are only reserved for non-citizens. It was President Trump's get tough approach on immigration, his relentless focus on the American worker, the American family, that helped him win the election against all odds. Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Giving into the melodrama of the moment is not the way to go. In fact, that will end up further burdening the American taxpayer, who's already fed up with a political system that sometimes makes them feel like second-class citizens. I know, Mr. President, you will not let them down. And that's the angle.